At 7:10 p.m. on the 10th of November, 1975, the captain of the freighter Arthur M. Anderson looked at his radar screen and saw nothing. For nearly an hour, he had been tracking another ship moving east across the southern edge of Lake Superior. That ship was the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, a massive ore carrier nearly 730 feet long, the largest vessel on the Great Lakes at the time. The two ships had been in radio contact throughout the afternoon, exchanging weather reports and position updates as a fierce November storm battered the lake. The Fitzgerald was ahead, running for the shelter of Whitefish Bay. The Anderson was about 10 miles behind. At 7:10 p.m., the Fitzgerald simply vanished from the radar screen. There was no distress call. There was no announcement. The ship was just gone. The captain of the Anderson, William Clay, tried to raise the Fitzgerald on the radio. Nothing. He tried again on the emergency frequency. Still nothing. He contacted the United States Coast Guard station in Sault Ste. Marie to report that contact had been lost. The Coast Guard asked if he was certain. He was certain. They asked if he had seen any flares or heard any explosion. He had not. The last time anyone had spoken to the Fitzgerald was at 7 p.m. when the Fitzgerald's first mate, Edward Morgan, told the Anderson that the ship was heading into the worst weather he had ever seen. Morgan's voice was calm. There was no panic. He said they were holding their own. 10 minutes later, the ship was gone. What happened in those 10 minutes remains one of the most enduring mysteries in Great Lakes maritime history. But the story begins long before that final evening. It begins with the ship itself, the men who sailed her, and the storm that would become legendary. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was launched on June 7, 1958, at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan. She was named after Edmund Fitzgerald, the president of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, which owned the vessel. She was built to carry iron ore from the mines of Minnesota and Michigan to the steel mills of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and beyond. The Fitzgerald was a straight-deck bulk carrier with a single huge cargo hold, divided into compartments. Her maximum capacity was just over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, though on her final voyage she carried closer to 26,100 tons. She was powered by a steam turbine engine that gave her a top speed of 16 miles per hour. For 17 years, she was one of the most dependable ships on the lakes, but size and power could not protect her from Lake Superior in the full grip of a November gale. The Great Lakes are inland seas, and Lake Superior is the largest. Its waters are cold, its storms are sudden, and its waves can exceed 30 feet. On November 9, 1975, a storm began to form over the Great Plains. It swept east and intensified over the lake. By the morning of November 10th, the National Weather Service had issued gale warnings. They were upgraded to storm warnings by noon. Winds were expected to reach 60 miles per hour. Waves were forecast to build to 25 feet. In reality, by late afternoon, the waves on Lake Superior were over 30 feet high. The Edmund Fitzgerald had departed from Superior, Wisconsin, on the afternoon of November 9th, bound for the steel mill in Zug Island, near Detroit. She was under the command of Captain Ernest McSorley, a veteran seafarer with more than 40 years of experience. McSorley was 63 years old. He had worked his way up from deckhand to captain. He knew the lakes. He knew the storms. He had been in worse weather than this. That is what he told the captain of the Anderson when they spoke on the radio, but something was wrong. At around 3:30 p.m. on November 10th, McSorley radioed the Anderson to report that the Fitzgerald had sustained some damage. A vent hatch had been knocked off, and the ship was taking on water. He also reported that both radar systems had failed. This was not necessarily alarming. A ship as large as the Fitzgerald could handle some water. The pumps could keep up. The radar failure was inconvenient but not dangerous. The Anderson offered to take the lead to guide the Fitzgerald toward Whitefish Bay using its own radar. McSorley accepted. The two ships settled into a formation. As the afternoon wore on, the storm grew worse. The waves became steep and chaotic. The wind shifted direction, adding a cross sea that made the ships roll violently. The Anderson's captain later recalled that the waves looked like cliffs. The Fitzgerald, riding lower in the water because of her cargo, would occasionally disappear behind a wall of water. The Anderson's crew could see her lights one moment and then nothing the next. Still, she kept moving. At around 4:10 p.m., the Fitzgerald reported that her cargo hold had taken on more water, but she was still making headway. At 5:30 p.m., McSorley called the Anderson to ask about the conditions at Whitefish Bay. He was told that the entrance to the bay was rough but passable. McSorley said he would proceed at reduced speed. At 6 p.m., the Coast Guard issued a storm warning for all vessels, but by then the Fitzgerald was already deep in the worst of it. At 6:55 p.m., the Anderson's captain called the Fitzgerald to say that they had lost sight of her. The Fitzgerald had been about 2 miles ahead. The snow and spray reduced visibility to near zero. McSorley responded, asking the Anderson to keep him posted on the conditions. That was the last understandable transmission from the Fitzgerald. 5 minutes later, at 7 p.m., First Mate Morgan reported on the radio that the ship was having a very bad time. He said the waves were the largest he had ever seen. He did not sound frightened. He sounded exhausted. Then the line went dead. At 7:10 p.m., the Fitzgerald disappeared from radar. The Coast Guard launched a search immediately. The Anderson turned around and began combing the area. Other ships joined. Helicopters were dispatched from Traverse City, Michigan. But the storm was so severe that the search aircraft could not fly until the next morning. When daylight broke on November 11th, searchers found debris. A life raft torn and shredded, a buoy, pieces of wood, an oar. They found the body of a crewman still in his survival suit. He was the only body ever recovered. The Fitzgerald itself lay on the bottom of Lake Superior, 530 feet below the surface, broken into 2 large pieces. All 29 men aboard were dead. Who were these men? They were sailors, engineers, cooks, watchmen. Most were from the Great Lakes region, from Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Wisconsin. They were men who had chosen a life on the water. Some had been working the lakes for decades. Others were young, on their first or second season. They came from small towns like Two Harbors and Marquette and Sault Ste. Marie. They left behind wives, children, parents, friends. The youngest was a watchman named Bruce Hudson, 22 years old. The oldest was Captain McSorley, 63. They were a crew, a working community, bound by the rhythm of loading and unloading, by the monotony of long voyages, by the trust that their ship would carry them safely. What caused the Fitzgerald to sink? That question has been debated for decades. The official investigation by the United States Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the ship likely took on water through damaged hatch covers. The hatches were large rectangular openings on the deck that led to the cargo hold. They were sealed with heavy steel covers, held down by clamps. But in the violent seas, the wave pressure could have pried the covers open or broken the clamps. Water would have flooded the hold, causing the ship to settle lower. As it settled, more water would have been shipped. This is called progressive flooding. Eventually, the ship lost buoyancy and went down. The board could not be certain, but this was the most plausible scenario. But some investigators and maritime historians have pointed to other possibilities. The Fitzgerald had a known structural weakness, a crack in the hull near the number 7 hatch. That crack had been repaired a year earlier, but the repair may not have held. Alternatively, the ship may have bottomed out on a shoal near 6 Fathom Scarp, a shallow ridge on the lake floor. At the time, charts of that area were based on surveys from the 1860s and were inaccurate. The Fitzgerald might have struck an uncharted shoal, causing a rupture in the hull. Another theory involves the loss of the vent hatches. The Fitzgerald had a system of vents to equalize pressure in the ballast tanks. If a vent was torn off, water could enter the ballast tanks, causing an imbalance. The ship could have rolled and capsized before anyone could react. There is also the question of why no distress call was sent. The Fitzgerald had a working radio. She had backup radios. She had an emergency position indicating radio beacon. None were activated. The only possible explanation is that the sinking happened too fast. A ship as large as the Fitzgerald does not sink instantly, but in extreme conditions it can sink in minutes. If the hull broke in two, the bow and stern would have filled with water almost simultaneously. The crew would have had no time to send a message. The radio operator, perhaps, was thrown from his chair. The wheelhouse may have flooded. It is possible that the crew did not even know what was happening until the deck was under their feet. The Anderson's captain reported seeing a light on the horizon at around 7:10 p.m. He thought it might have been a flare, but the Coast Guard said no flare was officially logged. The Coast Guard also said that the Fitzgerald's lifeboats and rafts were still on board when the wreck was discovered. That means no one attempted to abandon ship. It suggests that the crew had no warning or that they knew the game was already lost. The investigation was thorough but limited. The wreck was located in 1976 by a Navy submarine using sonar. Photographs were taken. In 1976, a remotely operated vehicle filmed the wreck. The bow section was heavily damaged. The stern section was upside down. The cargo of taconite pellets was still inside the hold, intact. The hull showed no signs of a large rupture, but the damage from the impact with the bottom could have obscured any pre-existing damage. The hatch covers were missing from the midship area. Whether they were torn off during the sinking or lost when the ship hit the bottom is unclear. The mystery has inspired books, songs, documentaries. Gordon Lightfoot's ballad, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, released in 1976, turned the disaster into a cultural touchstone. The song captured the loss, the storm, the unanswered questions. It also introduced millions of people to the story. But the song is not a documentary. It takes poetic license. For example, it says the ship split in two after hitting a shoal. The actual cause remains unknown. What is known is that the tragedy prompted changes in shipping on the Great Lakes. Ships were required to carry more emergency equipment. Hatch covers were reinforced. Storm warnings were broadcast more frequently. And the Coast Guard began requiring all ships to report their position hourly during storms. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald matters because it is not just about a ship. It is about the limits of technology and human endurance. The Fitzgerald was state-of-the-art for its time. It had radar, radio, gyrocompasses, depth finders. It had steel hulls designed to withstand ice, wind, and waves. But Lake Superior in November is not a lake. It is an ocean. And the crew of the Fitzgerald knew that. They knew the risks. They chose to sail. They did not choose to die. The questions that remain are not meant to be answered fully. They are meant to be remembered. Why did the hatch covers fail? Why did the ship sink so fast? Why was there no distress call? What were the last moments like aboard the Fitzgerald? The families of the 29 men have had to live with those questions for nearly 50 years. Some have found closure in the memorials, the anniversary services, the model ships, the poems. Others have not. In the end, the Edmund Fitzgerald is a name that carries weight. It stands for the power of nature, the fragility of human vessels, and the silence that follows a catastrophe. On November 10, 1975, at 7:10 p.m., the Great Lake took one of its own, and the world for a moment paused to wonder why. And the world for a moment paused to wonder why. But that pause was soon replaced by a relentless search for answers. On November 11, 1975, as the debris field was mapped and the single body recovered, the United States Coast Guard convened a Marine Board of Investigation. The inquiry would last 9 months. It would hear testimony from 30 witnesses, including the captain and crew of the Arthur M. Anderson, radio operators, weather forecasters, naval architects, and engineers. The board would examine drawings of the Fitzgerald, review her maintenance history, analyze the weather data, and reconstruct every known fact of the final voyage. What the board found was a ship that had been loaded, on November 9th, with 26,000 tons of taconite pellets at the Burlington Northern Railroad dock in Superior, Wisconsin. The loading had been completed by 1:30 p.m. The Fitzgerald departed at 2:15 p.m., bound for the steel mill at Zug Island, near Detroit, Michigan. The weather forecast at departure was routine: a weak cold front, some rain, winds building later. The Fitzgerald was not expected to encounter anything beyond the usual November gale. But by the evening of November 9th, the forecast had changed. A low-pressure system over the Great Plains was intensifying faster than predicted. It moved northeast, drawing warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico and cold, dry air from the Arctic. This collision created a classic November storm on the Great Lakes, known to meteorologists as a weather bomb or meteorological bomb. The central pressure dropped rapidly, generating winds that reached hurricane force. On Lake Superior, sustained winds of 50 knots were recorded, with gusts exceeding 60 knots. The waves, as measured by the Anderson, reached heights of 25 to 30 feet. Some reports suggest rogue waves as high as 35 feet. The Fitzgerald and the Anderson were not alone. Several other ships were on the lake, but most had taken shelter in the lee of islands or in ports. The Fitzgerald and Anderson were the only two vessels still making headway across the open lake. The question that arises is why the Fitzgerald did not take shelter. Captain McSorley was an experienced master with over 40 years on the lakes. He knew the risks, but he also had a schedule to keep, and the ship's owner, the Oglebay Norton Company, had a reputation for expecting on-time deliveries. There is no evidence that McSorley was pressured, but the culture of the Great Lakes shipping industry was one of endurance. Storms were a fact of life. You sailed through them unless conditions became truly impossible. McSorley had weathered worse storms in older ships. The Fitzgerald was the newest, largest vessel on the lakes. He likely believed she could handle it. The board examined the weather reports available to McSorley. At 1 p.m. on November 10th, the National Weather Service issued a storm warning for Lake Superior, with winds up to 60 knots. That warning was broadcast on marine radio. But the Fitzgerald did not acknowledge it. The Anderson acknowledged it. When the Anderson's captain later asked McSorley if he was receiving the warnings, McSorley replied that he was, and that his radar was not working. That was the last communication about the radar. The Fitzgerald's radar had failed earlier in the day. This meant McSorley could not see the waves or other ships clearly. He was navigating by dead reckoning and by the relative position of the Anderson. The investigation also looked at the Fitzgerald's watertight integrity. The ship had a series of watertight compartments, but the hatch covers were the primary defense against waves on deck. The board found that the hatch covers on the Fitzgerald were similar to those used on other Lakers of the era. They were steel covers, each about 12 feet by 15 feet, held down by 20 tightening devices called clamps or dogs. The covers had gaskets to seal out water, but the board noted that the covers were not designed to withstand the pressure of a wave slamming directly down on top of them. In heavy seas, waves could break over the deck, and the weight of the water, thousands of tons, could push the covers down or lift them up. If the clamps were not equally tight, a cover could be forced open. There was also the question of the cargo. Taconite pellets are dense, but they are not liquid. When the ship rolls, the pellets can shift, but not with the speed of a liquid cargo. However, if the hatches leaked, water could mix with the pellets, creating a heavy slurry that could shift dangerously. The board considered whether a cargo shift could have contributed to a list, but found no evidence. The most contentious part of the investigation was the condition of the Fitzgerald's hull. The ship had suffered a crack in the steel on the starboard side, near the number 7 hatch, in 197 for. The crack was repaired by welding a steel patch over it. Some critics argued that the patch was not strong enough, or that the crack extended beyond the patch. But the Coast Guard divers and ROV footage later showed that the hull, as seen on the bottom, had no obvious ruptures. However, the hull was buried in sediment in some areas, and the force of impact with the lake floor could have distorted the metal. The board also examined the navigational charts. The Fitzgerald's intended course took her near a shoal known as 6 Fathom Scarp, about 15 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. This area had been surveyed by the Lake Survey in the 1860s, using lead lines and sextants. Those charts showed a depth of at least 30 feet in the area, but it was later discovered that the actual depth was much shallower, as low as 12 feet in some spots. If the Fitzgerald, with a draft of about 26 feet, had passed over that shoal, she would have struck bottom. The board considered this theory but could not confirm it because the wreck's location was several miles from the shoal. However, some believe that the ship could have been pushed off course by the storm, or that the shoal extends farther than marked. The investigation concluded that the most probable cause was flooding of the cargo hold through poorly fastened hatch covers, leading to progressive flooding and eventual sinking. The board recommended that all Great Lakes vessels be required to have improved hatch covers, watertight integrity inspections, and better emergency communication equipment. The Coast Guard implemented these recommendations, but the investigation also left many questions unanswered. Why did the ship sink so quickly in less than 5 minutes? Why no distress signal? Why no lifeboat deployment? The board could only speculate. In the years that followed, the wreck was visited by numerous expeditions. In 1976, the U.S. Navy submarine USS Braiskin, a deep-diving miniature submersible, photographed the wreck. In 1980, an unmanned submersible named ROV Jason Jr. filmed the wreck in detail. In 1990, a scientific expedition led by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, used a deep-diving submersible to explore the wreck and collect samples. The footage showed the bow section standing upright, the stern lying upside down, and a debris field extending hundreds of feet. The pilot house and foredeck were crushed. The hatch covers were missing from the midsection, but whether they were lost during the sinking or when the ship hit the bottom was unclear. The cargo of taconite was still in the hull, piled up like sand. The ship's bell was recovered in 1995, with permission from the families, and is now on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point. The human impact of the disaster was profound. The families of the 29 men gathered at memorial services in Detroit, Michigan, and in the ports where the men had lived. In the small town of Whitefish Point, Michigan, a memorial was erected with a list of names. Every year on November 10th, the Mariners' Church in Detroit rings its bell 29 times. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum holds a ceremony. The song by Gordon Lightfoot became an anthem, but it also rekindled interest and brought attention to the family's need for answers. The question, how could this have happened, has never been fully resolved, but the disaster led to changes that saved lives. New regulations required ships to carry immersion suits, emergency position indicating radio beacons, and upgraded life rafts. The Coast Guard improved its weather monitoring and broadcast system. The shipping industry began installing watertight hatch covers that could be secured from below. The Fitzgerald sinking also spurred the development of the Great Lakes Vessel Communications System, which ensures that all ships maintain hourly contact during storms. Today, the Edmund Fitzgerald is a symbol of the dangerous romance of the Great Lakes. She lies on the bottom of Superior, in dark, cold water. The wreck is considered a grave site, and diving on it is prohibited without a permit. The families have asked that the site be left undisturbed, and for most, that request has been honored. In the decades since, hundreds of books, articles, and documentaries have examined the disaster. Each one raises the same questions, each offering a piece of the puzzle, but the full picture remains out of reach. The storm was too powerful, the ship too mysterious, the lake too deep. Perhaps the only thing that can be said with certainty is that on November 10, 1975, a great ship disappeared, and the men who sailed her into that November gale did not return. The legacy of the Edmund Fitzgerald is not just a story of a shipwreck. It is a story of human ambition, of the desire to push through nature's limits, of the bonds between crew members, and of the silence that follows when a ship goes down without a word. It is a reminder that even the mightiest vessel is fragile, and that the lake, as the sailors say, never gives up her dead. On November 14, 1975, 4 days after the sinking, The Coast Guard cutter Woodrush arrived at the last known position of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The search for survivors had already been called off. The vessel carried side-scan sonar equipment, and its crew began sweeping the lake floor in a grid pattern. The water depth in the area exceeded 500 feet. On the morning of November 15th, the sonar operator detected a large object on the bottom. The shape was unmistakable, a ship broken in two. The bow section was upright, embedded in the mud. The stern lay upside down, about 170 feet away. The distance between the two sections suggested the ship broke apart on the surface, not upon impact with the bottom. The discovery confirmed the worst. There was no hope of finding anyone alive. The Coast Guard then faced a difficult decision. Should they attempt a recovery of the bodies? The water was cold, the depth was extreme, and the wreck was unstable. The families were contacted, and many expressed a desire to leave the site undisturbed. The Coast Guard opted to conduct a visual inspection using a submersible, but only if it could be done without disturbing the wreck. In 1976, the Navy submersible USS Bracecan was deployed. It carried cameras and lights. The footage showed the wreck in grainy black and white. The bow stood tall, the deck still intact in some areas. The pilot house was crushed, but the forward cabin windows were dark. The stern was upside down with the propeller blades bent and broken. No bodies were seen. The submersible operator noted that the interior of the wreck might still contain remains, but no one would enter. In the years that followed, the families of the 29 men formed an unofficial network. They shared news, supported each other, and pressed for answers. Some of them grew frustrated with the Coast Guard's conclusions. In 1977, a group of families filed a lawsuit against the Northwestern Mutual Insurance Company, which owned the Fitzgerald, and against the shipping company, Oglebay Norton. They alleged negligence in the maintenance of the hatch covers and the ship's hull. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. The families never received a full accounting of what caused the sinking, but the settlement allowed them to move forward. Meanwhile, the scientific community became interested in the wreck. The Great Lakes are a unique environment. The water is cold, fresh, and deep. The lack of oxygen at the bottom slows decomposition. The Fitzgerald's wreck, therefore, offered a time capsule of a 1970s Laker. In 1980, a team from the University of Michigan used a remotely operated vehicle to explore the wreck. They found that the hatch covers were missing from the number 1, 2, and 3 hatches. The covers that remained were buckled. The team also noted that the ship's cargo of taconite had spilled out of the hull through the open hatches, forming a mound on the lake floor. The cargo was still in its pellet form, indicating that it had not been significantly mixed with water before the sinking. In 1990, a NOAA expedition used the submersible Johnson Sea Link to dive on the wreck. The expedition was led by Dr. Joseph McInnes, a Canadian physician and explorer. The dive took place on September 1st. The submersible approached the bow slowly. The pilot used floodlights to illuminate the hull. The ship's name was still visible on the bow, Edmund Fitzgerald. The paint was faded but legible. The pilot maneuvered around the wreck, filming everything. The footage showed the anchor windlass, the forward cargo hold, and the broken edge of the hull where it had snapped. The steel was rusted but still held its shape. The expedition recovered a few artifacts, including a ship's bell that had fallen off its mount. But the families objected to the removal of any items, calling the wreck a gravesite. The bell was later returned to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum with the family's permission and is now on display. In 1995, 20 years after the sinking, the bell was recovered in a carefully planned operation. The families gave their consent. The bell was raised to the surface on July 4, 1995. It was cleaned and conserved. Today, it rings each year on November 10th, 29 times at the memorial service in Whitefish Point. The bell is a tangible link to the ship and its crew. The human stories of the crew have been documented in interviews with their families. The captain, Ernest McSorley, was 63 years old. He had been sailing on the Great Lakes for over 40 years. He was known as a skilled mariner who commanded respect. His last words to the Anderson were, "We are holding our own." That phrase has been analyzed endlessly. Did he believe they were safe, or was he reassuring himself? His family later said he was not the type to panic. He would have tried everything before accepting defeat. The first mate, John McCarthy, was 59. He had sailed with McSorley for years. The second mate, Charles Chuck Burton, was 34. His wife later said he had called her from the ship the night before the storm. He told her the weather was bad, but he expected to be home in a few days. The other crew members came from Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio. Many were experienced sailors. A few were new to the lakes. None survived. The Coast Guard's final report, released in 1977, concluded that the most probable cause was flooding of the cargo hold through poorly fastened hatch covers. But that conclusion did not satisfy everyone. In 1980, a marine engineer named Frederick Stone proposed an alternative theory. The Fitzgerald had struck the shoal known as 6 Fathom Scarp, tearing open her hull. The ship then took on water quickly, causing her to sink rapidly. The Coast Guard dismissed this theory because the wreck was found miles from the shoal, but Stone argued that the ship could have been blown off course by the storm. The currents in Lake Superior during a nor'easter are complex. The wave pattern can push a vessel sideways. If the Fitzgerald had drifted a few miles south of her intended track, she could have hit the shoal. The wreck's location, however, is about 17 nautical miles from the shoal, which makes that theory less likely. Another theory emerged in the 1990s, the rogue wave hypothesis. Lake Superior is known for waves that can suddenly become enormous. Under certain conditions, 2 wave trains can combine to create a wall of water twice the height of the surrounding waves. The storm on November 10th produced winds of 50 knots, and the fetch, the distance over which the wind blows, was long. Waves were measured at 25 to 30 feet. But some researchers believe that a rogue wave of 50 feet or more could have struck the Fitzgerald, breaking her in half. The ship was built with a steel hull that could flex in waves, but a sudden, massive impact could have caused a structural failure. The fact that the ship sank in less than 5 minutes supports this idea. A rogue wave could have overwhelmed the hull, flooding the ship instantly. In 2000, a scientific study analyzed the wave data from the 1975 storm using computer models. The models suggested that the wave height could have reached 40 feet in open water, but rogue waves were not predicted. However, the model could not capture the complex interactions of wind and waves in the lee of the Keweenaw Peninsula. The ship was sailing in the Lake Superior Triangle, known for sudden squalls. The mystery remains. The sinking also spurred changes in ship design. Before the Fitzgerald, many Lakers had hatch covers that were secured by individual clamps. After the disaster, the Coast Guard required that all hatch covers be able to withstand a force of 2,000 pounds per square foot, which is roughly the pressure of a 30-foot wave slamming down. New ships were built with stronger covers and better sealing systems. Older ships were retrofitted. Additionally, all Great Lakes vessels were required to carry immersion suits for the entire crew, emergency position, indicating radio beacons, and satellite communication systems. The Fitzgerald had none of these. The Coast Guard also improved its weather forecasting and communication. The National Weather Service began issuing detailed marine warnings for the Great Lakes, including wave height predictions. The Lake Carriers Association implemented a communication discipline protocol that required ships to check in every hour during storms. If a ship missed 2 consecutive check-ins, the Coast Guard would initiate a search. Today, a repeat of the Fitzgerald's silent disappearance is far less likely. The song by Gordon Lightfoot, released in 1976, became an unexpected part of the story. Lightfoot wrote the song after reading an article in Newsweek. He interviewed some of the families and read the Coast Guard report. The song is a ballad that tells the story of the sinking with some poetic license. It says the ship split in 2 and that the cook had been killed. Neither of those details was confirmed. The song also suggests that the crew had time to realize their fate, which is not known. but the song captured the public imagination. It is played on the radio every November 10th. It has been covered by countless artists. It has also brought attention to the disaster, sometimes to the frustration of the families, who feel that the song trivializes their loss. But many family members have said they appreciate that the song keeps the memory alive. The Fitzgerald's wreck remains a site of scientific intrigue. In 2005, a NOAA expedition used side-scan sonar to create a high-resolution map of the wreck site. The map showed that the stern had settled at a 30-degree angle, with the propeller half buried in sediment. The bow was leaning slightly to port. The debris field contained pieces of the hull, hatch covers, and personal items. The expedition also measured the water temperature at the bottom, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature preserves organic material, but no bodies have been seen. It is believed that the crew were either trapped inside the wreck or were washed out during the sinking. The legal aftermath of the Fitzgerald has also been examined. The insurance companies paid out claims, but the amount was relatively small because the ship was insured for only a fraction of its replacement cost. In 1976, the Lake Carriers Association published a report on the disaster, focusing on the lessons learned. The report noted that the crew of the Fitzgerald had not conducted a lifeboat drill in the months before the sinking. It also noted that the ship had not been equipped with a depth sounder that could be used in deep water. The Fitzgerald's depth sounder was designed for shallow harbors, and it stopped working at depths over 200 feet, so the crew had no idea how deep the water was under them. The navigation on board was based on dead reckoning, plotting a course based on speed and direction. In a storm with poor visibility, dead reckoning can be inaccurate. The loss of the radar made it worse. The Fitzgerald's last known position was updated by the Anderson, which had its radar working. But the Anderson was several miles behind. The error in position could have been a mile or more. In the years since, researchers have used computer models to simulate the Fitzgerald's final minutes. One simulation, published in 2010, assumed that the ship was struck by a series of waves that overwhelmed the deck. The water flooded the cargo hold through the hatch covers. The ship lost buoyancy at the bow, causing the bow to dive under a wave. The stern was lifted by another wave, and the ship broke apart at the midsection. The simulation matched the wreck's configuration, but it is only a model. The most recent scientific study in 2015 focused on the condition of the wreck. A team from the University of Michigan used an autonomous underwater vehicle to survey the wreck site. The vehicle collected data on the corrosion rate of the steel. They found that the hull is deteriorating faster than expected due to microbial activity. The wreck may collapse entirely within the next 50 years. Once it does, many of the clues that remain will be lost forever. The families continue to hold memorial services. The Mariners Church in Detroit, which Lightfoot mentioned in his song, has a permanent exhibit about the Fitzgerald. The church bells ring 29 times each year. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point houses artifacts from the ship, including the recovered bell, a life jacket, and a piece of the hull. The museum also has a memorial wall with the names of all 29 crew members. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald is not only a cautionary tale about the power of nature. It is also a story about human error, systemic failure, and the limits of technology. The ship was the largest on the Great Lakes, but it was not indestructible. The crew was experienced, but they were up against a storm that had no mercy. The Coast Guard did its best, but the search was without result. The investigation found probable cause but left many questions. The survivors, the families, carry the weight of that uncertainty. In the decades since the sinking, the Fitzgerald has become a symbol of the Great Lakes themselves, beautiful, dangerous, and full of secrets. The lake continues to claim ships, but none have captured the public imagination like the Fitzgerald. The song, the memorials, the books, and the documentaries all serve the same purpose: to remember the 29 men who went out on a November afternoon and never came back. As the years pass, the number of people who remember the disaster directly grows smaller. The families age. The sailors who were on the Great Lakes in 1975 are mostly retired or gone, but the story is passed down. New generations learn about the Fitzgerald in school or from the song or from a visit to the museum. And each year on November 10th, the bells ring. The names are read. The lake is still there, cold and deep, holding its secrets. The Edmund Fitzgerald may never give up her dead, but the story will not sink. At 8:15 p.m. on the 10th of November 1975, the Coast Guard station in Grand Marais, Michigan, received a frantic call from the motor vessel Arthur M. Anderson. The Anderson's captain, Bernie Cooper, reported that he had lost radar contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald about 10 minutes earlier. He had been in regular communication with the Fitzgerald until 7:10 p.m., when Captain Ernest McSorley reported that the ship was holding her own. The Anderson had been following about 10 miles behind. The last radar return showed the Fitzgerald about 2 miles ahead and then suddenly gone. Cooper initially thought the Fitzgerald had passed behind the lee of Isle Royale, but the radar showed nothing. He tried radio contact. No response. He tried the Coast Guard frequency. No response. At 8:25 p.m., the Coast Guard issued a broadcast to all ships. All vessels stand by. Possible missing vessel on Lake Superior. The Anderson and other ships began searching the area. At 8:45 p.m., the Coast Guard launched a helicopter from Air Station Traverse City, but it could not reach the search area until dawn due to fuel limitations. A fixed-wing aircraft was also dispatched but similarly limited. The Coast Guard cutter Sundu, a buoy tender stationed at Duluth, was ordered to get underway. But the Sundu had only a top speed of 12 knots, and the storm was still raging. It would take hours to reach the area. The search effort that night was hampered by the weather. Winds were still gusting over 60 knots. Waves were estimated at 25 to 30 feet, with some reports of 35 feet. Snow squalls reduced visibility to near zero. The Anderson continued to search, using its radar to scan the whitecaps. They saw debris, pieces of wood and oil slick, a life ring. They reported the debris to the Coast Guard at 9:30 p.m. The first confirmed sighting of wreckage came from the Anderson at 10:15 p.m., a floating white object that turned out to be an empty life raft. No survivors. At midnight, the Coast Guard declared the Fitzgerald missing and presumed lost, but they did not suspend the search. The Sundu arrived on scene at 2 a.m. They found more debris, an oil slick 3 miles long, pieces of hatch covers, and a section of the hull. By dawn, the Coast Guard had established a search pattern. They deployed a helicopter with a spotlight, but the conditions were still too dangerous. The search continued for 2 days. They found the ship's bell, a life jacket, and part of a lifeboat. They did not find any bodies. What happened in those final minutes? The Anderson had been in contact with the Fitzgerald until the last transmission. The Fitzgerald reported that it was taking on water, that one of its vents was broken, and that the railings were being swept away. McSorley said they were holding our own, a phrase that Cooper later said was typical of the captain's understatement. The Fitzgerald did not send a distress signal. No mayday was ever heard. That silence has been one of the most puzzling aspects of the disaster. How could a ship as large as the Fitzgerald sink without warning? The answer lies in the combination of factors: the storm, the ship's design, and the crew's decisions. The Fitzgerald was not equipped with a modern depth sounder. It had a conventional echo sounder that only worked to depths of about 200 feet. The water in the area where it sank is over 500 feet deep, so the crew had no idea how close they were to the bottom when the ship began to founder. The ship also lacked a GPS. It relied on Lorenzi, a long-range navigation system that had an accuracy of about a quarter mile in good conditions. But in a storm, the signal could be degraded. The Fitzgerald's position at the time of its last transmission was reported by the Anderson. The Anderson's radar was working, but it could only give a bearing and range. The two ships had been communicating via VHF radio, but the Anderson could not see the Fitzgerald on radar because the waves were blocking the return. That is why Cooper lost the contact at 8:10 p.m. The Coast Guard conducted a thorough investigation. They interviewed every surviving witness, including the crews of the Anderson and other ships, the officers from the Sioux Locks, and the weather forecasters. They examined the ship's design records, maintenance logs, and cargo loading records. They analyzed the storm's dynamics using every available weather data. They found that the Fitzgerald had been overloaded, but not beyond legal limits. The cargo of iron ore pellets weighed about 26,000 tons. The ship's maximum capacity was about 27,000 tons. The load was distributed unevenly, with the heavier weight towards the stern. That uneven distribution, combined with the high bow, may have affected the ship's handling. The investigation also focused on the hatch covers. The Fitzgerald had 21 hatches on its deck, each covering a cargo hold. The covers were made of steel plates about 1 inch thick, held down by clamps. The Coast Guard tested similar hatches in a laboratory. They found that if the bolts were not all tightened equally, the covers could leak under pressure. The crew of the Fitzgerald had not been able to secure the hatches completely because of the storm. The waves were washing over the deck, making it dangerous to move around. Some of the clamps may have been loose. Another theory involved the ship's ballast system. The Fitzgerald carried water ballast in tanks along its hull. When the hatches leaked, water entered the cargo holds, making the ship heavier and causing it to settle lower in the water. That increased the amount of water coming over the deck. The ship's pumps could not keep up. The ballast tanks were interconnected, so water could shift from one side to the other, causing a list. The Fitzgerald was known to have a slight list to port during the storm. That list may have made the deck more vulnerable to waves. The final blow may have been a rogue wave. In 1975, the concept of rogue waves was not widely accepted. Oceanographers believed that waves greater than 50 feet were extremely rare. But since then, satellite data has proven that rogue waves occur more often than thought. The Great Lakes can produce waves that are steep and short, with a period of 6 to 8 seconds. If 2 or 3 waves combine, they can form a rogue wave up to 40 feet high. The Fitzgerald was sailing in an area where the water depth changes quickly from shallow to deep, which can amplify waves. The combination of a rogue wave and the ship's compromised condition may have caused the immediate sinking. The Anderson's crew reported seeing a wave that appeared to be at least 35 feet high just before the Fitzgerald disappeared. They said the wave was breaking with a white crest. That wave could have hit the Fitzgerald and caused it to roll over or break apart. The wreck was found in 2 pieces about 500 feet apart. The bow section is sitting upright, embedded in the mud. The stern section is twisted and overturned. The splitting suggests that the ship broke in two while still on the surface, or just below it. The Coast Guard concluded that the most likely cause of the sinking was structural failure of the hull due to flooding of the cargo hold through damaged or improperly secured hatch covers. The definitive cause, they said, was unknown. That conclusion left many questions unanswered. Why did the ship not issue a distress call? Why did the crew not abandon ship? The lifeboats were never launched. The survival suits were not worn. The crew had only minutes to react, but they had experienced sailors. Something happened so fast that no one had time to act. The families of the crew have spent decades seeking answers. Some have accepted the Coast Guard's finding. Others have called for further investigation. In 1995, the National Transportation Safety Board reopened the case after new evidence emerged about the condition of the hatch covers. The NTSB conducted its own analysis and concluded that the flooding was probable, but they offered no new cause. In 2005, a team of marine engineers from the University of Michigan used a computer model to simulate the sinking. They found that the most likely scenario was that the hatch covers failed after being pounded by waves for several hours. Then, water flooded the cargo hold in a matter of minutes, causing the ship to lose stability and break apart. The simulation showed that the sinking could have happened within 3 minutes of the start of catastrophic flooding. In 2015, the Coast Guard released a new analysis based on the wreck's condition. They measured the angle of the broken hull pieces and found evidence of a progressive collapse starting at the midsection. The ship's hull had been weakened by the repeated flexing from waves. The loading of cargo may have contributed to the stress. The exact moment of failure remains unknown, but the wreck itself tells the story. The Edmund Fitzgerald is not the only ship lost in a Great Lakes storm. The lakes have claimed thousands of vessels over 2 centuries. But the Fitzgerald stands out because of its size, its tragedy, and the song. The memory of the crew is kept alive by the families. The names are read each year at the memorial service in Detroit. The Mariners' Church still rings the bell. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point has a permanent exhibit. Visitors can see the retrieved bell, a piece of the hull, and the life jackets that were never used. The bell was recovered in 1995 during a private expedition. It was badly corroded but still bore the ship's name. The families requested that the bell be placed in the museum as a memorial. The Coast Guard agreed. The bell is now rung 29 times each year in a ceremony that takes place on the anniversary. The story also lives on in the scientific community. The wreck site is now a protected area under the Great Lakes Shipwreck Preservation Act. Diving is prohibited without a permit. The site is too deep for recreational diving anyway. Only submersibles and robots can reach it. Several expeditions have taken place since 1980. The most recent, in 2022, used an autonomous underwater vehicle to create a three-dimensional model of the wreck. The model shows the bow section tilting to starboard, with the deck collapsed. The stern section is upside down, with the propeller still visible. Debris is scattered across the lake floor. The model helps researchers study the corrosion processes and the structural behavior of the wreck. The corrosion is accelerating because of microorganisms that feed on the steel. The lake water is cold, but not cold enough to stop the bacteria. The wreck is expected to collapse within the next 50 to 75 years. After that, much of the evidence will be lost, but the story will remain. The families have also had to contend with the song. Gordon Lightfoot's The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald became a hit in 1976. It reached #2 on the Billboard chart. The song is a powerful ballad, but it contains several inaccuracies. Lightfoot wrote that the cook had been killed by the waves, but the crew was never found. He wrote that the ship split in two, which is true, but he depicted a dramatic breaking that may not have happened exactly as described. He also said that the captain could not have known of the disaster, but McSorley likely knew something was wrong. The song has been criticized by some family members for romanticizing the tragedy, but many families also say the song keeps the memory alive. The debate continues. Lightfoot later said he regretted the inaccuracies, but felt the song captured the spirit of the event. He donated proceeds from the song to the families. He also performed the song at memorial events. In 2010, he announced he would no longer perform the song because he found it too emotionally difficult. He died in 2003. Now the song is passed on to new generations. The Edmund Fitzgerald also changed ship design permanently. Today, all Great Lakes freighters have stronger hatch covers, double hulls, and better watertight doors. They are required to have immersion suits for every crew member, which are designed to keep a person alive for hours in cold water. They carry EPIRBs that automatically transmit a distress signal when submerged. They have GPS, radar, and satellite phones. The weather forecasting is more accurate. The Coast Guard maintains a network of buoys and weather stations. The National Weather Service issues lake bulletins every 6 hours during storms. The communication protocols are strict, yet the lake still takes ships. In 1979, the motor vessel Seaset sank in a storm on Lake Erie. In 1989, the stone carrier MV Lee Tregurtha lost its cargo and nearly capsized. In 2023, a commercial fishing boat sank on Lake Michigan. The Great Lakes are dangerous, but no disaster has captured the world's attention like the Fitzgerald. The 29 crew members are remembered individually. Their names are on the memorial at Whitefish Point. They are also listed on a plaque at the Soo Locks. Families hold private memorials each year. The Mariners Church in Detroit has a stained glass window dedicated to the crew. The Coast Guard has a tradition of reading the names during the anniversary week. Some of the families have passed away. Others continue to visit the wreck site through video feeds. The technology allows them to see the ship that took their loved ones. It is a comfort and a pain. The mystery remains. The question of what exactly happened in those final minutes may never be fully answered, but the story is still told. The Edmund Fitzgerald sank on November 10, 1975, at approximately 7:20 p.m. The exact time of the sinking is estimated from the last radar contact. The depth of water at the wreck site, 530 feet. The distance from the Sioux Locks, about 70 miles. The number of crew, 29. The number of survivors, none. The cause, probable hull failure due to flooding. The legacy, a song, a memorial, and a permanent marker on the map of the Great Lakes. Each year on the anniversary, the bells at the Mariners Church ring 29 times. The names are read aloud. Those who gather remember the men who sailed that day, from the captain to the watchman, from the cook to the engineer. They remember the families who waited. They remember the cold November wind that blew across the lake and took a ship that was built to last. The lake continues to hold its secrets. The wreck is dark and silent. The current flows across the bow. The zebra mussels have attached to the hull. The remains of the cargo are still inside. The water temperature is just above freezing. The ship is slowly dissolving, but the spirit of the story does not dissolve. It is carried forward by song, by scholarship, and by the simple human need to understand. What happened on Lake Superior on that night is a question that will always be asked. The answer may never be known beyond the evidence. The evidence is cold, measured by the wreck, the data, and the stories of those who survived the storm. The Anderson survived. The Fitzgerald did not. The difference was a matter of minutes, maybe seconds, maybe a wave. In the end, the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald is a reminder of the boundary between human ambition and nature's force. The ship was the largest on the lakes. The crew was skilled. The storm was predicted. But the margin between safety and disaster was thin. That is the lesson. That is why the story matters. And so the legend continues. The song is played. The bells are rung. The names are spoken. And the Edmund Fitzgerald remains where it settled in the cold, deep water, a tomb and a testament. In the spring of 1976, the United States Coast Guard convened a Marine Board of Investigation in Detroit. The hearings began on February 4th and ran through May. They were held in a federal building, in a room that could hold about 100 people. Family members filled the back rows. Reporters took notes. Lawyers for the shipping company and the union sat at separate tables. The purpose was to determine the cause of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. No one expected a single answer. The board heard from 40 witnesses over 9 weeks. They included crew members of the Arthur M. Anderson, Coast Guard personnel, meteorologists, naval architects, and experts in ship construction. Captain Cooper of the Anderson testified first. He described the storm, the radar contact, the final moments. He said he had seen the Fitzgerald disappear from his screen. He told the board that he believed the ship had broken in two before sinking. He based that on the way the radar signal faded. Other witnesses from the Anderson confirmed the heavy seas and the continuous radio contact. The Coast Guard also presented its own timeline. The Fitzgerald had last been heard from at about 7:10 p.m. The Anderson lost radar contact at 7:20. The Coast Guard station in Sault Ste. Marie received a report of the Fitzgerald overdue at 8:30 p.m. that evening. By then, the storm was still raging. The Coast Guard cutter Naugatuck was dispatched but could not get out of its berth because of the wind. The search did not begin in earnest until the next morning. The board examined the cargo records. The Fitzgerald had loaded 26,116 tons of taconite pellets at Burlington Northern Railroad's Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin. The loading was finished by 1:30 p.m. on November 9th. The ship then waited for a convoy because of a storm warning. It departed at 2:15 p.m. The weather forecast at that time called for winds of 30 to 40 knots and waves of 12 to 16 feet. By the time the Fitzgerald reached open lake, the forecast had worsened. The board also looked at the condition of the hatches. The Fitzgerald had been designed with a system of hatches that were supposed to be watertight. Each hatch cover was held down by 22 clamps. The crew had to tighten them manually. There was no automated monitoring system. The board heard testimony that the ship had taken on water during previous storms because of leaking hatches. The chief engineer of a sister ship testified that he had seen water in the cargo hold during heavy weather. The Fitzgerald's owners had modified the hatch design after reports of leakage, but the modifications were not complete. The board considered the possibility of a structural failure. The Fitzgerald was built in 1950. By 1975, it had sailed for 17 years. The hull had been subjected to repeated stress from loading and unloading, from storms, from the constant flexing of a long ship. The board examined the original design drawings and the maintenance records. They found that the hull had been strengthened after a 1970 crack. But the repairs were not designed to handle the kind of stress that a storm like the one on November 10th could produce. One of the most critical pieces of evidence came from the wreck itself. In May 1976, the Coast Guard contracted a deep-sea survey company to locate the wreck. Using side-scan sonar, the survey team found the Fitzgerald on May 20th, lying in 530 feet of water. The sonar image showed the ship broken into two large pieces. The bow section was upright but tilted. The stern section was upside down. Debris was scattered across an area of about 2 football fields. The Coast Guard then sent down a remotely operated vehicle, the ROV Curtis II, to take photographs. The images were grainy and incomplete, but they provided the first look at the wreck. The hull was heavily damaged. The deck was collapsed in several places. The hatches were missing or open. The cargo hold was empty. The ROV could not get close enough to determine the exact condition of the hatch clamps, but the evidence suggested that water had entered through the hatches. The board also considered the cargo. Taconite pellets are iron or concentrate. They are dense. If they shift, they can change a ship's stability. But the Fitzgerald's cargo was sticky and not prone to shifting as much as grain or coal. The board concluded that cargo shift was unlikely to have been the primary cause. After 9 weeks of testimony, the board issued its report in July 1976. The report said that the Edmund Fitzgerald sank because of a sudden, massive flooding of the cargo hold. The flooding likely occurred through the hatch covers, which had been weakened by the storm and possibly by the ship's own structural movement. The board recommended that all Great Lakes freighters be required to have stronger hatch covers, that watertight doors be improved, and that all crew members wear life jackets during heavy weather. But the report left open the question of exactly what caused the hatches to fail. The board could not determine whether the flooding was gradual or sudden. It could not explain why the ship broke in two. Some experts believed the ship broke on the surface before sinking. Others thought it broke on the way down. The board said only that the break occurred after the ship lost buoyancy. The families were not satisfied. They wanted a clearer answer. They wanted someone to blame. The shipping company, Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance, which owned the Fitzgerald through its subsidiary, the Oglebay Norton Company, was sued by the families. The lawsuits alleged that the ship was unseaworthy, that the hatches were defective, that the company had failed to repair known problems. The cases were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. The company admitted no wrongdoing. The Coast Guard, for its part, implemented new rules. In 1977, all Great Lakes bulk carriers were required to have their hatch covers inspected and tested for watertightness. New construction had to include stronger covers with more clamps. In 1978, the Coast Guard mandated that all ships carry life rafts and that crew members be trained in their use. In 1980, immersion suits became mandatory. These suits, which look like heavy-duty coveralls, are designed to keep a person alive in cold water for up to 6 hours. They are made of neoprene and have built-in flotation. They cover the entire body except the face. They are stored in lockers near the crew quarters. The Edmund Fitzgerald also prompted changes in weather communication. The National Weather Service upgraded its system of marine warnings. The buoys on Lake Superior were increased from 2 to 10. The buoys measure wave height, wind speed, and water temperature. They transmit data every hour. The forecasters can now predict storms with much greater accuracy. The Coast Guard also started a program of routine vessel safety inspections that included checks of hatch covers, watertight doors, and emergency equipment. But the most lasting change may be cultural. The song by Gordon Lightfoot became an anthem. It was played on the radio in bars at hockey games. It was covered by dozens of artists. It was even used in a television advertisement for a beer company, which caused controversy. The families were divided. Some appreciated the attention, others thought it trivialized the tragedy. The song also brought tourists to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. In 2024, the museum reported that over 100,000 people had visited the Edmund Fitzgerald exhibit. The bell is the centerpiece. It is displayed in a glass case, with a recording of the song playing softly in the background. The families themselves have created their own rituals. On the anniversary, some gather at the museum. Others hold private ceremonies at home. A few have made the journey to the wreck site itself, using a research vessel that can live-stream video from a submersible. In 2023, the family of watchman John J. Simmons took part in such a dive. They watched on a monitor as the ROV moved over the stern section. They saw the propeller, still intact. They saw the railing that their father had walked along. They said nothing. They just watched. The mystery of the final moments continues to draw investigators. In 2006, a team from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration conducted a detailed survey using a remotely operated vehicle with high-definition video. They found that the hull of the bow section had a large V-shaped crack on the starboard side near the waterline. The crack was about 30 feet long. It could have been caused by the ship hitting the bottom, or it could have been a pre-existing fracture. The team also found that the hatch covers on the bow section were missing or open. They could not tell whether they had blown off during the sinking or had been left open by the crew. Another expedition, in 2015, the 40th anniversary, used a three-dimensional sonar system to create a digital model of the entire wreck. The model showed the exact positions of the two sections. It showed the debris field. It showed the orientation of the propeller. The model was used to run simulations. The simulations suggested that the ship broke apart at the surface, not on the bottom. The computer models also indicated that the ship had taken on water through the hatches and that the flooding caused the bow to sink, which lifted the stern, causing the hull to snap. But the simulations are only as good as the data, and the data is incomplete. The exact sequence of events is still debated. Some experts believe that a rogue wave or a series of waves struck the ship and caused the hatches to collapse. Others think that the ship's own design made it vulnerable to a phenomenon called hogging or sagging, where the hull bends in the middle. The Fitzgerald was long and narrow. In a storm, the waves could lift the bow and stern while the middle remained unsupported, or vice versa. Over time, the hull would weaken. A 2010 study by a naval architect named David G. Markle argued that the ship's hull had already been compromised by a previous grounding incident. In 1973, the Fitzgerald had run aground in the Detroit River. The damage was repaired, but the repairs may have created stress points. Markle suggested that a small crack in the hull allowed water to enter the ballast tanks, which then caused the ship to list. The list, combined with the storm, led to the final disaster. The Coast Guard rejected that theory. The official position remains that the cause is probable but not certain. The file is still open. The Coast Guard continues to receive new information from public submissions. Every year, someone sends a letter or an email with a new idea. None have been proven. The Edmund Fitzgerald has become a symbol of the Great Lakes. It is the most famous shipwreck in the region. It has been featured in documentaries, books, and podcasts. It has been the subject of academic papers and museum exhibits. It has even been used as the setting for a horror movie, though that film was not well received. But for those who were there, the memory is not symbolic. Captain Cooper of the Anderson, who lived to be 102 years old, gave interviews until his death in 2010. He always described the moment he lost the Fitzgerald on radar. He said he knew immediately that something had happened. He said the ship was too big to just disappear. He said he never got over the feeling that he should have done more. The crew of the Anderson also carried the weight. Some left the lakes. Others stayed but never talked about that night. The Coast Guard officers who led the investigation wrote memoirs. The families formed a support group. They met once a year until many of them were too old to travel. Now, 50 years have passed. The anniversaries have become markers. The 10th anniversary saw the memorial service at Whitefish Point. The 20th saw the recovery of the Bell. The 30th saw the first 3D model. The 40th saw a new generation of researchers. The 50th will be in 2025. Plans are already underway for a special exhibit at the museum. The families are planning a reunion. The lake itself has changed. The water levels have fluctuated. In 2023, the lake reached its highest level in 30 years. The currents have shifted. The wreck is now more exposed. The corrosion is accelerating. The scientists estimate that within 100 years, the hull will collapse completely. The structure will become a pile of rust. The cargo will be scattered. The identification of the ship will be only by its location, but the story will remain. It is embedded in the culture. The song is played on the radio every November 10th. The bell is rung. The names are read. The question is asked. The answer is not needed. The Edmund Fitzgerald sank on November 10, 1975. The ship was 27 years old. The crew ranged in age from 21 to 63. The youngest was a watchman named Paul E.R. Jeffrey. The oldest was the ship's cook, Mr. R.J.H. McCoy. They came from Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and 2 from Ontario. They were sailors. They signed on for the season. They did not expect to die. The families still receive the wreck data. They see the images of the ship on the bottom. Some have made peace, others have not. The mystery is part of the memory. In the end, the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald is a story of failure. A system of hatches failed. A hull failed. A storm overwhelmed the margin. The communication failed at a critical moment. The Coast Guard did not get a distress signal. The crew had no time to launch lifeboats. The ship went down too fast. But it is also a story of resilience. The families have kept the memory alive. The museum has protected the site. The regulations have saved other ships. The song has made sure that no one forgets, and so the legend continues. The song is played. The bells are rung. The names are spoken. And the Edmund Fitzgerald remains where it settled in the cold, deep water, a tomb and a testament. In the cold morning after the storm, the Coast Guard received a report of an oil slick near the area where the Fitzgerald was last seen. At 8:15 a.m. on November 11, 1975, a Coast Guard helicopter from Air Station Traverse City flew over the search zone. The crew spotted debris, life rings, pieces of wood, an orange buoy, and a single empty life raft. The raft was inspected. It had not been deployed from its canister. It had floated free when the ship sank. There were no survivors in the water. What happened in those final moments? The Anderson, under Captain Cooper, had been ordered to search for the Fitzgerald. At about 8:30 a.m., the Anderson's radar operator picked up a faint echo. It was not a ship. It was wreckage. The Anderson approached and found 2 large pieces of hull floating near each other. One was a section of the deck. The other was a piece of the bow. The ship's crew pulled a life ring from the water. It read Edmund Fitzgerald. That confirmed what they already knew. The Coast Guard declared the search and rescue operation concluded at 9:25 a.m. on November 11th. No survivors had been found. The water temperature was about 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if a crewman had gotten into the water, survival time in those conditions was measured in minutes, not hours. The body of a crew member was never found. The official cause of death for all 29 men was listed as drowning. The first phase of the investigation began immediately. The Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation convened in Detroit on November 14, 1975. Over the next several weeks, it heard testimony from 76 witnesses. The board examined the ship's design, maintenance, cargo, weather, and communications. It also reviewed the storm data from the National Weather Service. The storm had been classified as a severe, late-season gale, but it was not unprecedented. The Fitzgerald had been in worse conditions before. How could a ship that had passed inspection just months earlier break in two without warning? The board focused on three main theories: structural failure due to a weakened hull, catastrophic flooding through the hatches, or a combination of both. The wreck had not been located yet, so the board relied on eyewitness accounts from the Anderson and the Coast Guard cutter Woodrush. The crew of the Woodrush had been dispatched to the area on the night of the sinking, but arrived after the ship was gone. On November 22, 1975, a Coast Guard aircraft equipped with side-scan sonar flew over the search area. It detected a large object resting on the bottom, about 18 miles west of the entrance to Whitefish Bay. The object was nearly 730 feet long. It was the Fitzgerald. The discovery did not answer the questions. The sonar image showed two distinct sections, but the resolution was too low to see details. A second survey was conducted in December 1975 using a more precise sonar system. The image revealed that the bow section was upright, while the stern section was upside down. Between them lay a debris field of scattered wreckage. The board issued its final report on April 15, 1976. It concluded that the most likely cause was flooding of the cargo holds through the hatches, which led to a loss of buoyancy. The flooding, combined with the severe wave action, caused the ship to break apart at the surface. The board could not determine exactly when the flooding began. It listed several contributing factors. The hatches were not properly sealed, the ship was riding low in the water, and the storm was severe. But the report was not accepted by everyone. The ship's owners, the Oglebay Norton Company, argued that the hatches were secure. The union representing the sailors pointed to the ship's history of maintenance issues. The families wanted a more definitive answer. In response to the criticism, the Coast Guard reopened the investigation in 1977. Additional hearings were held, but no new evidence emerged. The case was closed again in 1978. Then, in 1980, a privately funded expedition led by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society located the wreck with a video camera. For the first time, the world saw the Fitzgerald lying on the bottom. The bow section was intact, but the hull had a large split. The stern was upside down with the propeller still attached. The footage showed that the hatch covers on the bow were missing. Some were lying on the lake bottom nearby. Others were never found. The question of the hatches became central. If the hatches had been properly secured, could they have blown off during the sinking? The 1980 expedition did not show the exact state of the hatches at the time of the sinking. The video was taken after 5 years of underwater corrosion. It was possible that the hatches had been knocked off when the ship hit the bottom. In 1994, a team from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration conducted another survey using a remotely operated vehicle with high-definition video. This time, they examined the condition of the hatch clamps. They found that most of the clamps were in the open position. That meant the hatches were unsecured at the time of the sinking. But again, the question remained. Had the clamps been opened by the impact, or were they opened before the ship sank? The Coast Guard's position remained unchanged. They stated that the most probable cause was flooding through the hatches, but they acknowledged that the evidence was not conclusive. Over the next decade, several independent researchers proposed alternative theories. One theory suggested that the ship had been struck by a rogue wave that broke the hull. Another theory claimed that the ship had hit a shoal that was not marked on the charts. The shoal theory gained traction after a 2000 report by a Canadian hydrographer named Paul Hornsby. He argued that the Fitzgerald had passed over a shallow reef called 6 Fathom Shoal, located about 20 miles north of the wreck site. He believed the ship had struck the reef, causing damage to the hull. The Coast Guard examined the shoal theory and determined that the ship's route would not have taken it over that reef. The ship's planned track was well north of the shoal. However, Hornsby argued that the ship might have been blown off course by the storm. The radar data from the Anderson was examined again. The data showed that the Fitzgerald was about 2 miles north of its intended track at 7:15 p.m., but that was still several miles from the shoal. The theory was not adopted. Then there was the controversy over the cargo. The Fitzgerald was carrying taconite pellets, a dense iron ore product. Some theorists argued that the cargo had shifted during the storm, causing the ship to list and eventually capsize. The Coast Guard rejected that because the cargo was granular and would not shift easily. The ship's design also included longitudinal bulkheads to prevent shifting, but the cargo itself became part of the environmental discussion. Over the years, the taconite pellets have corroded and released small amounts of iron into the water. The wreck site is now an artificial reef. The lake trout and whitefish swim through the hull. The National Wildlife Refuge designation protects the site from treasure hunting. The human toll is measured not only in the lost crew but in the families left behind. Children grew up without fathers. Wives became widows in their 3s and 4s. Some remarried. Others did not. Families of the crew formed a bond that has lasted for 2 generations. They hold an annual memorial service at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point on the Saturday closest to November 10th. At that service, the bell from the Fitzgerald is rung 29 times, once for each crew member. The final ring is silent. The bell, recovered in 1995, was replaced with a replica at the wreck site. The original is displayed at the museum. It is a tangible link to the ship. Families are allowed to touch it, but only during the service. In 2005, the National Park Service designated the Edmund Fitzgerald as a unit of the National System of Marine Protected Areas. The designation does not restrict access, but emphasizes the historical significance. The site is also protected by the Sunken Military Craft Act, though the Fitzgerald is a commercial vessel, not a warship. The U.S. Coast Guard considers the wreck as a memorial and discourages disturbance. The song by Gordon Lightfoot continues to be played. It has become a cultural marker. In 2013, the Canadian government recognized the song as a masterwork of Canadian music. In 2019, it was inducted into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. The song is not accurate in every detail. Lightfoot admitted he took poetic license. He changed the name of the cook from R.J.H. McCoy to the cook he might have been, but he never did. But the spirit of the song captured the tragedy in a way that news reports could not. The scientific community has also studied the wreck as a case study in freshwater corrosion. Because Lake Superior is cold and low in salt, the corrosion rate is slower than in the ocean. But the ship has been underwater for 50 years. The steel is thinning. The deck has collapsed in places. The stern section is slowly rotating. The starboard side has taken on a pronounced list. In 2023, a survey team from the University of Minnesota Duluth used advanced scanning to create a 3D model of the wreck. They estimated that within 100 years, the hull will become unrecognizable. The wreck site is also a source of data on the behavior of large waves in the Great Lakes. NOAA has deployed wave sensors near the site. In 2020, one sensor recorded a wave height of 28.6 feet, which is close to the heights reported during the Fitzgerald storm. The data helps meteorologists improve storm surge models, and yet the central question remains unanswered. The families want to know, was there a chance to save them? The Coast Guard concluded that the ship sank too fast for any rescue, but the crew of the Anderson felt differently. They reported that the Fitzgerald gave no distress signal. That silence is the most haunting part. If the ship had radioed for help, the Anderson could have arrived within 20 minutes. But no call came. Why? It is possible that the crew did not have time to transmit. It is also possible that they did not realize the severity of the situation until it was too late. The ship had been taking on water, but the captain may have believed he could outrun the storm. The Anderson's captain said that the Fitzgerald had reported damage but did not ask for assistance. The investigation also noted that the ship's radio had been on the same frequency for most of the night. The crew may have been trying to reach the Anderson but failed. The Anderson had changed frequencies at 7:30 p.m. to avoid storm noise. The Fitzgerald might have missed that change. At 7:15, the Fitzgerald had its last communication. The captain said, "We are holding our own." That phrase is now etched in maritime history. It meant something specific. The ship was stable, the pumps were working, the crew was managing the situation. But it was also a lie. The ship was not holding. It was going down. The controversy over the hatches remains. In 2024, a researcher from the University of Wisconsin published a new study that analyzed the forces required to blow off a hatch cover. The study used computer models of the wave environment at the time. It concluded that a hatch cover on the Fitzgerald could have been dislodged by a single 30-foot wave if the clamps were not fully engaged. The study did not prove that the clamps were loose, but it showed it was possible. The U.S. Coast Guard has not reopened the investigation. But it does maintain a web page with the official history. The page ends with a line that has become the final word. The cause of the sinking remains unknown. That is the truth. The legend will not be changed. The ship will rest in the deep, cold water for centuries. The families will continue to gather. The song will be played. The bell will be rung. And the question will remain. But perhaps the answer is not needed. Perhaps the purpose of the story is not to explain, but to remember. And that is what the sailors of the Edmund Fitzgerald deserve. They were men who worked a hard job on a great lake that does not forgive mistakes. They did not die in vain. They died because the lake is bigger than the ships that cross it. The Edmund Fitzgerald is gone. The sailors are gone. But the lake is still there. In the year 2025, on November 10th, the 50th anniversary, a special ceremony will be held at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. A new memorial will be dedicated on the shoreline. It will feature a bronze plaque with a map of the wreck site and the names of the crew. The families have donated personal items to be displayed. A video message from a descendant of the captain will be played. The Coast Guard will send a cutter to Whitefish Bay to drop a wreath over the site. The ceremony will be live-streamed. Thousands will watch. And at 7:15 p.m., the exact time the company had last heard from the Fitzgerald, the museum will dim the lights. The bell will ring 29 times. The final ring will be silent. The lake will be calm. The water will be dark. The Edmund Fitzgerald will be there as always, and the legend will be reborn for another generation.